This presentation, titled How Regulatory Authorities Use Policy and Standards to Support Food Systems, comes to us from Colin Christmas. Colin joined Eagle in 2019 as a managing director to support Eagle's international growth. He's an experienced professional with more than 20 years in the food industry working for Nestle. Colin has had the privilege to live and work in numerous countries around the world, which helped him develop an excellent understanding for process systems and standardization while working with different cultures. He has a bachelor's degree in computing and business analytics from the University of Huddersfield, with specialization in quality control, quality management systems, and business process management. He also has program completion certificates from Wageningen University and research for food safety management, and from the London Business School for an executive leadership program. And with that, take it away, Colin.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Colin Christmas, and today I am presenting how regulatory authorities use policy and standards to support food systems. So to start the presentation today, I really wanted to start the audience to think about systems and food systems holistically. So effectively, what are food systems? And then food systems are here. They are ecosystems. They encompass the whole entire range of actors that are interlinked value-adding activities. So we're looking at production, processing, distribution, consumption of food products. It's really an end-to-end, originating from agriculture and forestry or fisheries to really the broader implications of economic, society, natural environments in which they're embedded. So a full definition is with the FAO in the bottom of this page. So when we look at food systems, so one of the first things I wanted to talk about is food security. So food security is ultimately, do we have enough food to eat as a population, as a global population? So if we look back at 2020, there was a risk of hunger that was almost set to double by the end of the year as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So as a result of that, that can generate a lot of fears, a lot of concerns. The World Food Programme stepped in with figures that indicated over 130 million lives and livelihoods would be at risk. So when we look at global food systems, we understand they're super complex. We understand that population growth is a key factor, and we understand that international trade has a key part to play in ensuring food security. So let's look at trade restrictions. So essentially, trade restrictions, barriers to trade have increased in recent years. And notably, again, the World Trade Organization highlighted this. And during a crisis, typically countries would adopt a food policy restrictive measure that would include trade restrictions. So ultimately, a pandemic could result in food insecurity. So to combat this risk or mitigate this risk, what we saw from the Food and Agriculture Organization from the United Nations, the FAO, they announced a COVID advisory to countries to resist imposing preemptive export restrictions, which was normally a typically policy response in a health crisis. So it's really good to see that these organizations like the WTO and the FAO understanding the implications of food security or insecurity and actually addressing that during a crisis. So what's a good example of a benchmark policy from a regulator? So one of the examples would be in Latin America and the Caribbean. We saw that the ministers and secretaries of agricultural, livestock production, and fishing and food, this ultimately was 26 countries signed a declaration detailing measures to work and coordinate the supply of sufficient and safe food in the region. And this avoided food insecurity for over 620 million inhabitants during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this would be regarded as a benchmark policy. So, okay, we go back to food systems. We looked at food security. Now let's look at another subsystem of food security, which would be regarded as food safety and food fraud. So again, during the pandemic of the last 12 months, and which will obviously go into this year as well, there has been a reduction in the number of second party, third party, and regulatory inspections. So there's less audits and less inspections. So what's the consequences of that? Well, ultimately, the consequences are that we don't fully know what that's going to be. It's not yet determined. And why is that? Well, with food safety, food fraud, there's often a lag of 12 to 18 months where food safety requirements are not met over a period of time. And without oversight, they may actually become more problematic without these audits and inspections. So in addition, we have ingredients in our supply chain that are in storage. They're not yet consumed into finished products, and they're not yet consumed by the consumer at the end of the food system. So ultimately, we don't know where we're at in terms of impacts. We may see major incidents and recalls. We may not. But ultimately, if anyone asks the question, what is the result of food safety in connection to the recent pandemic? The answer is we don't know. Ultimately, we will know food safety and food fraud related impacts due to the current pandemic, but it will not be measurable until around 2022. So how do we mitigate the risk? So when we ask this question, we want to look at regulators and we want to look at organizations. How can they help? How can they collaborate together? So we've already mentioned that some of these ingredients are in the supply chains and they're not yet consumed. So the recommendation to regulators and organizations is 2021, 2022 is really additional focus on supply chain verification programs. So as I mentioned before, ingredients, they've been produced in 2020. They haven't been consumed yet. So let's look at some examples. IQF, individual quick frozen foods. There's a lot of fruits, vegetables, seafood, and poultry in this category. So that would be something that would be a keen focus on for regulators and organizations. In addition, if we look at food fraud, the likelihood of food fraud could increase due to food insecurity, as I mentioned before, another key part of a food system. And when there's food insecurity and when there are financial problems, which we will see as a result of the pandemic, there will be motivation for economic gain. And if there's less oversight happening from a regulatory position with regulatory inspections, and if there's less oversight from a third-party audit perspective, there may be a potential reduced threat of getting caught. So with this in consideration, the key thing is consider additional audit criteria or additional inspection criteria, supplier questionnaires, and increased sampling and analytical testing. So let's look at a benchmark policy to combat that. From a regulatory point of view, we have seen regulators responding by adopting ICT, information communication technology methods for remote food safety inspections during the pandemic. We've seen this, for an example, in the US with the US FDA, Food Drug Administration. They have moved to remote importer inspections under their foreign supply verification program. We've seen this in New Zealand with the Department of Primary Industries. We're seeing this in other places in Australia with the Victoria Department of Health and the New South Wales Food Authority in Australia. All of these regulatory authorities are conducting remote inspections. So during a pandemic, we are seeing regulators changing their mindset, moving to ICT and adopting remote inspections. And I think this should be regarded as a benchmark policy during a crisis and a pandemic. So, okay, I've talked about the pandemic and I've talked about how regulators are contributing and playing their part to support food safety, food fraud, and food security. So beyond the pandemic, where do we go? Where do regulators need to go? So the key thing here is regulators need to work collaboratively. And ultimately, they need to look at outcome-focused and process-based approach. Writing policy with reference to international voluntary consensus standards, and using things like the CASCO toolbox, which is the Committee for Conformity Assessment. And CASCO is ultimately a committee that works on issues relating to conformity assessment and improving international trade opportunities by reducing technical barriers to trade. And it's written with respect to helping regulators write public policy. Okay, so now we understand where the regulators need to start thinking more on, and it's important to come back to what's the industry we're in, and ultimately reflect on that a little bit today, because this is one of the key takeaways that I hope you have from the presentation today. So food manufacturing, what is it? essentially food manufacturing is a process industry. It's process manufacturing, and it's a method that is creating goods by combining suppliers, ingredients, raw materials using formulas and recipes. So what we see is it's frequently used in industries that create bulk products. And this includes food and beverages, but it also includes other industries like oil, gasoline, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and plastics. So when we look at that, I think we have to compare that to other types of manufacturing. And this is really important because with food manufacturing, it is a process approach. It's about ingredients, it's about formulas, it's about bulk materials. And then in comparison, we have discrete manufacturing. So discrete manufacturing is more of a product approach, and that looks at parts, it looks at bill of materials, it looks at individual units. So the examples of discrete manufacturing is things like the automotive sector, aerospace sector, where they would have a product approach. So now we understand a little bit more about a process approach versus a product approach. Understanding that food manufacturing is defined as a process industry, we actually see that most global brand manufacturers adopt a process approach for conformity assessment using process-based management systems as their foundations. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's look at the global brand manufacturers. There's Nestle, who I used to work for. There's Mondelez, there's Coca-Cola, there's Kraft, there's Cargill. All of these are good examples of organizations that have adopted a process-based approach to management systems. Now, with this, they also run ERP systems, SAP, which have modules called PPPI. It's production planning for the process industry. So hopefully you're seeing a connection here is how the industry works, the tools that organizations use like SAP and PPPI for process industries, and the approach to conformity assessment uses process-based systems as well. And they are all interconnected. So the key thing is here is if all of the big brand manufacturers with hundreds and hundreds of factories around the world are using a process approach, we need to consider this from a regulatory perspective, and regulators need to understand what really is a process approach and whether they apply that versus a product approach. So a key quotation that comes here is compliant product has to come from a process to comply. You cannot inspect a product to comply, it has to be produced to comply. Now, a key thing here is, this is a quote from the USDA, Steve Olson from the United States of Agriculture. So we're seeing a lot of regulators who are embracing this approach. And the key message today is for other regulators who are not, is to actually explore this in a little bit more depth, because this is how the industry works. And then I want to talk about standard definitions today. So with standard definitions, we see three definitions that are key. Now, when we talk about standards, what are the differences between standards? And it's really important to know the differences and how they differentiate from one another. So here's some standard definitions. We have voluntary consensus standards. So these are standards that are developed and adopted by voluntary consensus bodies, both domestic and international. Then we have industry standards. So these standards are developed in the private sector, but not in the full consensus process. So typically these require a financial contribution, and that's often standard owner fees. And then finally, we have government standards. So government standards are standards that are used by the government for its own uses. So why are definitions important from a regulatory perspective? Well, the key thing here is regulators are often instructed by the government offices to adopt primarily voluntary consensus standards. This is before they rely upon industry standards or develop their own government standards. And so understanding the definitions is when you're working with standards and when regulators are working with standards and working with industry, it's good to know whether you're working, if that industry partner is working with industry standards, voluntary consensus, or the regulator is choosing to write a government standard. And then ultimately, if authorities can reference international voluntary consensus standards, they can translate internationally accepted criteria into public policy. And therefore, internationally accepted criteria is going to reduce barriers to trade and enable a common language. Okay, so what's an example of a voluntary consensus standard? We have the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. This is an example as an independent, non-governmental organization that develops voluntary consensus international standards. So this is an organization, they have 165 national standards bodies. So they are globally represented by different national standards bodies around the world. And each member then represents ISO in its own country. So in comparison to industry standards, individuals within the ISO standards cannot become members, individuals or companies. And an example for the food sector is you have Technical Committee 34 and Technical Committee Subcommittee 17 that represent food safety, food products, and management systems combined. And then the second piece, we've talked about process-based approach. We've talked about process. Now, the other key takeaway for you today to take from this presentation is outcome focused. This is a key to understand this terminology. And if you don't understand it, I recommend you do further reading on the subject. So when you look at international voluntary consensus standards, they are designed to have global range. They are broad, and ultimately they are defined as outcome focused. What does that mean? It means the factors that need to be considered and the results that need to be achieved. What is the expected outcome of a food safety management system? And that broad global range then allows the system, the management system, to be applied to any organization in any part of the world in any size. So that enables it to fit with ultimately the food industry. And this definition of outcome focused is supported by the World Economic Forum, the WEP, and they have a recent publication that explain that outcome focused regulation will be and must be used as part of a more agile approach to regulation. And then the counter argument comes from concerns from the FAO in relation to the proliferation of private food safety standards, which are regarded as more prescriptive than outcome focused. Okay, so let's look at a common vocabulary. I mentioned that briefly before. The FDA, we have seen the Food Drug Administration in the US defined a preventative controls qualified individual, a PCQI. So most people are probably aware of that qualification. Most people in the audience probably have that qualification. So that was defined as part of their final rule for preventative controls for human food. When we look at that in comparison, we see ISO 22000 as the international voluntary consensus standard with just under 40,000 certified sites globally. They have a different definition. They define this as food safety team leader. So hopefully the audience today can start seeing that the difference, it may be just a name for a PCQI versus a food safety team leader. But ultimately the question, the open question to the audience today is, when you have different definitions for the same thing, does that result in redundant training? And does that result in a redundant qualification to meet a regulatory national requirement? And the opportunity there for me would have been that there a common vocabulary could have and should have been adopted. So what's the regulatory impact? When we see regulators write public policy without reference to voluntary consensus standards, there isn't a common language between public and private sectors. And then what we see is this results in teams and teams of lawyers coming into organizations, and they are hired to translate what the regulatory requirements mean to their business or to the industry. And that adds additional unnecessary costs and ultimately is a burden to the food industry, because the industry is talking a different language compared to the regulator. So let's look at some benchmark programs that is helping to address this for food safety. Well, the good news is that with numerous food safety standards available and used by organizations that are not endorsed by regulatory authorities, the challenge is how do we create that alignment? Well, the good news is Codex, the Codex Commission, which is a joint FAO, WHO organization, have created a new guideline. Currently, this is a draft, and it's the draft principles and guidelines for the assessment and the use of voluntary third-party assurance programs. The acronym is VTPA. which I'm sure you'll probably hear more of in the coming months and years. So this really helps regulators to incorporate third-party programs into their risk-based profile, into their regulatory approach. And ultimately, if organizations have gone to the time and effort to be certified against a third-party standard, hopefully regulators will start to understand that will help them in terms of a risk-based approach to regulatory inspections. So in addition to that, we have seen last year, the FDA have launched a pilot program for 2021 to evaluate third-party food safety standards as well. So it's really good to see now regulators stepping up and working with industry and to understand how the industry standards work and how they can regulate against them. Okay, so let's go back to food systems again. Let's look at the bigger picture. So we've talked about food security, we've talked about food safety, we've talked about food fraud. And ultimately, a stronger food system doesn't come without consideration to the environment. We have to look at the environment, ecosystems, and biodiversity. So let's consider that half of the world's habitat, if we not include the desert-free and ice-free regions, is used for agriculture. So half of the world's land is used for agriculture. So what's the impact? What's the environmental impact for that food system? Well, 26% of greenhouse gases are contributing from agriculture. 50% of the land use, as I mentioned, agriculture. 70% of fresh water that's used around the world is for agriculture. Then you see the ocean and freshwater pollution. 78% of pollution, of ocean and freshwater pollution, comes from agriculture. And then biodiversity. So the mammal biomass that used for livestock for our food system around the world is 94%. So it's huge. You really start to understand that the food system is a very complex thing, and it would need close oversight and an understanding of how that complex system works. So taking that into consideration, knowing that the food system has a huge impact on the environment, we have seen that ISO standards as a benchmark are supporting public policy for environmental and energy management. We've seen environmental impacts with ISO 14001, we've seen greenhouse gases for 14064 and 14065, and energy management for 50001. In addition, we see ISO published guidelines for land use, so establishing good practices for combating land degradation and desertification. So that's ISO 14055. Okay, so that's the impacts of the environment, and what else is going on from a regulatory perspective that could benefit the food systems or even food safety. So one benchmark example is we see an International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF, and this is put together for a medical device single audit program, MDSAP, using a voluntary consensus standard, ISO 13485. So here, as I mentioned before in the presentation, is regulators need to collaborate. It's super important that they do that, and that is happening today, but without an official forum within food safety. So we see this within medical devices, and regulatory authorities in Australia, Brazil, Canada, throughout Europe, Japan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, and the United States, all to come together in an organized forum to work on regulating medical devices. So the open question again for the audience today is, would regulatory authorities benefit from creating a similar forum for food safety to understand their implications in working in a food system? And then the conclusion for today. So, as I mentioned before, we have to start thinking about food systems, not just food safety. Regulators need to think and act in terms of protecting the food system. Today, a food safety regulator will think and act in terms of protecting the consumer at the end of the food system. So the strategic thinkers, the senior people within regulatory authorities, need to be interconnected and thinking strategically, holistically about the food system. Now, why is that so important? I think we've probably seen this data before. We have about 7.8 billion people in 2020. This is projected to reach 9.9 billion by 2050. So in the next 30 years, we have a lot more people coming to this planet that needs to be fed. Now, is our current food safety systems, is our current food systems capable to manage that increase in population? My belief it isn't today, which is why we need to improve and strengthen our food safety systems. And we need to do that with further collaboration, with further regulation, and considering food systems as interconnected. So that's food safety, that's food security, that's environmental impacts. We could go even further than that from a regulatory perspective. We could look at occupational health and safety of the food system. We can look at social responsibility, social compliance within that food system as well. And ultimately coming together, as I mentioned before, barriers to trade have increased in recent years. By more collaboration, we can remove those barriers to trade. So we are ready to feed 9.9 billion people by 2050. How do we do that? As I mentioned before, we have ISO standards that are voluntary consensus. They support public policy, and more importantly, they're designed to be integrated. So with that, they bring a common vocabulary for organizations, and a common vocabulary for regulators. And this enables common ways of working. So just a few sites and resources I wanted to share before I wrap up today. We have the Global Food Security Index, which is a great resource for looking at food security in different parts of the world. They have metrics around affordability, availability, quality, and food safety, with looking at the risk factors of availability of natural resources and reliance upon them. In addition, there's some websites that have been produced this year, or sorry, in 2020, that are for case studies for public sector organization using conformity assessment, accredited conformity assessment, many case studies there. Within there is a food and agriculture sector. So if you're working in the regulatory sector, these are good case studies to see what is going on around in food safety and agriculture in different parts of the world with different regulatory authorities. And then finally, some information on voluntary consensus standards in the Casco Toolbox. We have various publications from ISO about ISO and food, ISO and agriculture, and the Casco Toolbox, as I've mentioned before. So thank you very much. As I mentioned, my name's Colin Christmas. I'm happy to take any questions. And if you have any questions or thoughts or suggestions, please feel free to email me at my email address at colinchristmaseaglecertification.com. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Colin Christmas, for that look at regulatory policies as they support food systems. And that concludes this presentation.